In the quiet dawn of the frontier, a lone healer stands between two worlds on the edge of war. One side is a fierce Drake Lord with 70 warriors at his back. The other is her own people, armed and ready to strike. In her hands lies the life of a young Drake she saved, and the fragile chance to stop a battle before it begins. What she chooses next could change the fate of the land forever. If you are new to the channel, then please subscribe to the channel and like the video and tell us where are you watching from. Now, let's jump into the story. The sun hung low over the horizon of Miraver, casting long shadows across the dry plains. The air shimmered with heat even in the late evening, carrying with it the scent of wild sage and the faint tongue of volcanic stone from the distant ridge. Marin Thale knelt in her small garden, her hands deep in the dusty soil as she checked the roots of her desert herbs. Her modest home stood alone on the outskirts of the settlement, a safe distance from the bustle, but close enough for her to be called when someone needed a healer. She had lived here for 12 years, long enough to understand the rhythms of this frontier. The wind had a voice, the ground had moods, and the sky could change from calm to chaos in moments. Her neighbors whispered about the dangers beyond the settlement fence, predators, shifting sands, and most feared of all, the embercrest drakes of the Silver Ridge. Marin had treated more wounds than she could count, but she had never stopped listening for certain sounds. Tonight, as the light faded to gold, she heard one dot. It was sharp and high-pitched, cutting through the heavy air like a blade. It wasn't human. It wasn't mechanical. The cry had a melodic rise and fall, a sound she recognized from rare nights when the wind carried voices from the mountains. It was Drac, Onic. She froze, her hands still in the soil, her heart pounding. Another cry followed, this one more urgent, almost desperate. Marin stood quickly, brushing the dirt from her palms. Without a second thought, she grabbed her old canvas, water bag, and the length of braided rope she kept by the door. Her boots crunched against the hard ground as she moved toward the sound, weaving between thorny scrub and low, twisted trees. The cries grew louder as she neared the edge of a wide, dried riverbed. The cracked surface stretched across the valley floor like a scar, its pale dust catching the last light of the sun. She knew this place well. It was where shifting sand basins formed after seasonal floods. They looked solid, but could liquefy under pressure, trapping anything that stepped in. She scanned the far side and spotted movement. Her breath caught half buried in the ground, struggling against the invisible grip of the basin, was a young embercrest drake. Its scales shimmered copper and gold in the fading light, each breath lifting its narrow chest with effort. Its four claws clawed at the surface, but every movement seemed to drag it deeper. Marin's mind worked fast. The basin would harden around him the longer he stayed still, but sudden force could pull him under entirely. She stepped to the edge, careful to stay on the firmer ridges of soil. "Don't move," she called out, unsure if the young drake would understand. To her surprise, his golden eyes locked on hers. He froze, his breathing quick but controlled. Marin took a slow breath. "Good," she said softly, though mostly to herself. She searched the riverbed for anything she could use and spotted a fallen branch of ironbark half buried in the dust. She dragged it closer and slid it toward him. "When you can reach it, take hold. Let me do the pulling." The drake stretched out his claws, but fell short by a hand's width. Marin cursed under her breath, kicked off her boots, and moved closer, spreading her weight evenly across the surface. The heat from the dust rose against her skin as she stepped into the danger zone. "What's your name?" she asked, keeping her voice calm and low. "Kale," he said, his voice hoarse but clear. "Kale," she repeated. "Strong name. I'm Marin. We're getting you out. This time, When she pushed the branch forward, Cale gripped it with both claws. She felt the pull immediately, his weight anchored deep in the sand's grasp. "Hold tight," she said, planting her heels into the firmest patch she could find. She pulled slowly, using steady force. The basin resisted, clinging to him with a sound like wet clay tearing apart. Cale's claws tightened, but he didn't cry out. His pride was evident even through the pain. Inch by inch, his chest emerged, and his midsection. Marin's muscles burned, sweat dripping into her eyes. She shifted her stance and gave one final pull, throwing her weight backward. With a sucking sound, Cale came free and collapsed onto solid ground. Marin dropped to her knees beside him, scanning for injuries. His forearms were scraped raw, and faint cuts lined his hind legs. But it was the way he held his side, just beneath his wing, that told her something more serious was wrong. "Does it hurt to breathe?" she asked. Cale hesitated, then gave a small nod. Marin pressed gently along his ribs and felt the tension in his muscles. "Cracked rib, maybe too," she said. "You can't travel far like this." His gaze shifted toward the mountains. "I can't stay here," he murmured. "You can't go home yet either," she replied firmly. "If those ribs aren't treated, they'll heal wrong. You'll be in pain for the rest of your life." He studied her face, suspicion and confusion mixing in his eyes. "Why would you help me?" Marin paused, feeling the weight of the question. "Because you're young," she said at last. "And because I'm a healer. That's reason enough." The evening wind rose, carrying with it the scent of the high ridges. Somewhere in that distant range was Cale's family. Somewhere closer were the people of the settlement who would see his presence as a threat. Marin glanced toward her home. "Come on, my place is near. We'll get you cleaned up." Cale staggered as he stood, his legs shaky, but he didn't lean on her. Pride. Again. She matched his pace, keeping close enough to steady him if he stumbled. As they crossed the last stretch to her door, Marin felt the faint vibration of the ground under her feet. It was probably nothing, a distant tremor, the shift of the wind. But a thought flickered through her mind, unshakable and heavy. Helping him would not go unnoticed. And this was only the beginning. The door to Marin's home creaked as she pushed it open, holding it wide for Cale to step inside. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of herbs and wood smoke. Shelves lined the walls, stacked neatly with jars of dried plants, rolls of bandages, and old medical tools, polished to a soft shine. In the corner, a small fire crackled in the hearth, giving the single-room dwelling a quiet warmth. Cale hesitated on the threshold, his golden eyes sweeping across the space. His scales were duller now in the dim light, his wings tucked tight against his back. Marin noticed the way his tail shifted slightly, a restless motion that betrayed unease. "Sit there," she said, pointing to the sturdy wooden chair by the table. "I need to see the damage before we decide what comes next." Cale obeyed, lowering himself slowly, his breath hitching when the chair pressed against his injured ribs. Marin knelt beside him, her hands gentle but firm as she unwrapped a strip of cloth from her supplies. "You're lucky I found you when I did," she said, dipping a rag into a bowl of warm water. "Those shifting sand basins don't let go easily." "I wasn't looking for trouble," Cale muttered, his voice low. "I had to retrieve something important." Marin looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "Important enough to risk your life so close to human territory?" He didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the fire. She decided not to press him. Trust would come slowly, if at all. She cleaned the scrapes along his forearms first, a warm water loosening the dried dust and blood. The cuts were shallow but numerous, and she worked carefully to avoid causing more pain than necessary. Cale sat still, though his claws gripped the edge of the chair with quiet tension. "You've been through worse, haven't you?" Marin asked softly. His eyes flicked to hers for a moment. "My kin train us to endure. Pain is part of life." "That may be true," she said, "but some pain is worth easing. It doesn't make you weaker." He didn't respond, but she noticed. The tightness in his shoulders eased slightly. When she finished with the surface wounds, she moved to his ribs. Her fingers pressed gently along the bruised area, feeling for breaks. Cale winced, but did not pull away. "2 cracked ribs," she confirmed. "You'll need support and rest. If you strain them, you could puncture a lung." "Then I can't return home yet," he said quietly. As if admitting it to himself for the first time, Marin began wrapping the bandage around his chest, pulling it snug, but not so tight that it restricted his breathing. "Not for at least a week, longer if you want to heal properly." As she worked, Cale watched her in silence. Finally, he asked, "Why are you helping me? Your people wouldn't want this." Marin paused. "I've lost someone before. A child. I know what it means to see someone so young in danger. Healer or not, I couldn't walk away." Cale's gaze softened, and for the first time, she saw more than pride in his expression. There was something like understanding. After the bandaging was done, Marin poured him a cup of warm herbal tea, a blend of local sage and imported chamomile. He sniffed it cautiously before taking a small sip. "Strange," he said, "but not bad." "Strange is how most things begin," she replied with a faint smile. They sat in silence for a while, the crackle of the fire filling the space. Marin studied the young drake, noting the way his eyes kept drifting toward the window that faced the distant mountains. She recognized the longing there, the pull of home. "Your family will be looking for you," she said. "They will come." He replied simply, "They always do." There was no fear in his voice, only certainty. Marin wasn't sure if that certainty should comfort her or make her uneasy. The night deepened, and Marin offered him her bed, insisting she could sleep by the fire. Cale accepted with a nod, but paused at the doorway to the small room. "My people tell stories of humans who once traded with us long ago, before the fighting, before the fear." "Your people aren't the only ones with those stories," Marin said. "But stories are easy to forget when anger and loss take their place." He studied her for a moment longer. "Maybe they can be remembered." Marin didn't answer. She knew the gap between their worlds was wide, but there was something in his voice that carried hope. As Cale disappeared into the bedroom, Marin poured herself another cup of tea and sat at the table. She could feel the weight of the decision she had made pressing on her. Sheltering him was dangerous. If the overseer or the settlement guard found out, the consequences would be swift and severe. But she also knew she couldn't have done anything else. Leaving him in that basin would have been no different than killing him herself. The fire burned low as she sat thinking. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a sound she almost didn't notice at first, a faint, distant rumble. She sat, her cup down, and leaned toward the window, listening. It came again, deeper this time. Not thunder, not machinery. It was the heavy beat of wings. Many wings. Her breath caught. She glanced toward the bedroom where Cale lay hidden. His kin had found him. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was coming for her door. Marin woke before sunrise to a sound that did not belong to the quiet plains. It was steady, rhythmic, and powerful, the deep thud of wings cutting through the cool morning air. She sat up from her spot near the fire, her heartbeat matching the rhythm outside. The light creeping through the window was pale gold, outlining the silhouette of Cale standing in the doorway to the bedroom. His eyes were fixed toward the east, where the sound was growing louder. "They're here," he said simply. Marin rose and moved to the front window. Her breath caught. Over the rise of the hills, dark shapes swept toward her home, dozens of them. The morning sun caught on metallic. Scales, silver, bronze, deep green, as the Drake warriors descended. They moved as one, their wings beating in perfect unison, forming a semicircle as they landed around her property. At their center stood one Drake, unlike any she had seen before. Taller than the rest, his wings shimmered with streaks of silver, and his gaze was sharp and unyielding. Marin knew without being told, this was Veros, Kale's father and lord of the Silver Ridge. The ground shook slightly as the last warriors touched down. The air felt heavy, as if holding its breath. Before Marin could decide what to do, the sound of engines roared from the opposite direction. A line of settlement riders on hoverbikes raced toward her home, dust swirling behind them. At their head was Overseer Branth, his face set in a scowl that carried both suspicion and anger. Marin's stomach tightened. She was standing in the middle of two worlds that had only ever met in battle. Branth dismounted, his boots striking the ground hard. "Step away from the house, Marin," he called out, his voice sharp. "Those creatures didn't come here for peace." Veros took a single step forward, the sunlight glinting off the curve of his talons. "I have come for my son," he said, his deep voice carrying clearly. Though accented, his words in human tongue were precise. Brant's hand twitched near the blaster at his belt. "Your kind doesn't walk into human land with an army unless you're looking for a fight." Kale appeared at Marin's side before she could stop him. "She saved me," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I would have died in the basin, if not for her." The words seemed to hang in the air, neither side willing to react first. Marin felt every eye on her, waiting. "He came here injured," Marin said finally. "I treated his wounds and kept him alive. That is the only reason. You see him standing." Veros's gaze shifted to her. "You did this knowing the risk?" "Yes," Marin answered without hesitation. "Because he is young and needed help. That's reason enough for me." A flicker of something, respect perhaps, crossed Veros's face. "And you have my gratitude. And my word that you will not be harmed." Brant's voice cut in, sharp with disbelief. "Gratitude from a Drake means nothing when they can turn on you in an instant." She broke settlement law by aiding an enemy. Marin stepped forward, placing herself between the two men. "If saving a life makes me an enemy to my own people, then perhaps we need to ask ourselves what kind of people we've become." The line of Drake warriors shifted, the rustle of their wings filling the tense silence. Marin could feel the moment teetering, ready to tip toward violence with the slightest wrong move. Veros glanced down at Kale, who stood tall despite his bandages. In their shared look was something unspoken, pride, relief, and a bond that no one could sever. "You have done what few would dare," Veros said to Marin. "And for that, you have the respect of the Silver Ridge. If ever you are in need, call for us, and we will answer." Marin nodded, the weight of his promise settling heavily on her. But Brant's face darkened further. "Your offering." "Her protection?" he said, his voice rising. "You think we'll just let a human ally herself with your kind?" "I offer her my word," Veros replied evenly. "Something your people should value." Brant's hand moved again toward his weapon, and in that instant, the sound of arrows being drawn filled the air as the Drake warriors readied their bows. "Stop," Marin said firmly, her voice carrying enough force to freeze the moment. "There will be no bloodshed here today." She turned to Branth. "Put your weapon down and listen. I have one day to speak with the settlement and explain what happened here. One day to try and keep us from stepping into a war we can't win." Brant's jaw tightened, but after a long moment, he lowered his hand. Veros inclined his head. "One day," he said. Tomorrow at dawn, we will return for your answer. But know this, if you choose to punish her for this act of mercy, we will have our own decision to make." With that, Varos stepped back, signaling to his warriors. They moved as one, their wings unfolding with a powerful sweep. Kale turned to Marin, his eyes bright. "Thank you," he said simply, before joining his father. The Drake host rose into the pale morning sky, their shadows sweeping over the plains. Before they vanished toward the mountains, Maran stood in the doorway of her home, the dust from their departure still swirling around her. She had one day to change the course of what was coming, or to watch the plains burn. The dust had barely settled when the last shadow of the Drake warriors vanished beyond the ridgeline. The air felt thinner, as if the land itself had been holding its breath during the standoff. Marin stood in the doorway of her home, her mind heavy with the weight of Varos's words. One day, that was all she had. Overseer Branth and his riders lingered at the edge of her property. Their engines idled, the low hum mixing with the distant sigh of the wind. Branth's eyes were locked on her, cold and unyielding. "You've crossed a line, Marin," he said, his voice low but carrying enough to reach her ears. "The council will hear of this before nightfall." "Then let them hear the truth," Marin replied. "That a life was saved when it could have been left to die. That no harm came to the settlement." "Truth doesn't change fear," Branth said, swinging onto his hover bike. "And fear is what keeps people in line." With that, he signaled his riders, and they turned back toward the settlement, leaving only the swirl of dust and the bitter echo of his warning behind. Marin closed her door and leaned against it for a moment. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the enormity of the choice before her. She had less than a day to speak for peace in a place where fear had long dictated every law. The morning passed in quiet preparation. She cleaned her small home, not out of necessity, but to keep her mind from drifting into doubt. Her thoughts returned again and again to Kale's expression as he left. Pride, gratitude, and a trace of something else. Hope, perhaps. By midday, the sun beat down hard on the plains, turning the air heavy and still. Marin walked to the settlement, her steps measured, her head held high. The streets grew quieter as she passed, the stares of neighbors following her. Whispers curled through the air like smoke. She found the council hall near the center square, its stone walls casting deep shadows across the worn steps. Inside, 5 members of the settlement council sat behind a long table, Branth among them, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Marin told them everything. She spoke of the shifting sand basin, of finding Kale, of his injuries and her decision to treat him. She described the arrival of Varos and his warriors, and the offer of protection they had made. When she finished, the hall was silent. Counselor Enric, the eldest member, leaned forward. "You know aiding a Drake is a violation of settlement law," he said. "I know," Marin replied. "But laws should protect life, not condemn it. If our fear blinds us to compassion, then we've already lost more than we realize." Branth scoffed. "You speak as if they're our equals. They've raided our caravans, burned our fields. You think one act of kindness will erase that?" "No," Marin said, "but it can be the first stone laid on a bridge. We cannot change what has been, but we can choose what comes next." The council deliberated for hours. Marin waded in the square, the sun sliding lower in the sky, painting the horizon with streaks of orange and gold. Villagers came and went, some avoiding her gaze, others offering small nods of quiet support. As dusk settled, the council called her back. Their decision was cautious, but clear. No charges would be brought against her. The settlement would not seek conflict, but neither would they accept an alliance without further proof of the Drake's intentions. Marin left the hall with the decision weighing on her shoulders. It was not the peace she had hoped for, but it was not war. Not yet. The night was restless. She slept lightly, waking often to the sound of the wind moving through the dry grass. In the still hours before dawn, the faint beat of wings returned, growing louder until it filled the air. She stepped outside as the first light touched the sea. Horizon. Veyros and his warriors descended once more, their formation tight and purposeful. Kale sat at the front of his father's saddle, his bandages still in place, but his eyes bright. Veyros landed before her, the ground trembling beneath his weight. "Well?" he asked. "No war," Marin said. "Not today. The settlement will?" "Wait. They want to see if your word can be trusted." Veyros regarded her for a long moment. "Trust is built in time, not granted in a day," he said. "But you have taken the first step. For that, you will not stand alone." Kale slid down from the saddle and stepped toward her. "I told you they would come," he said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Marin returned the smile. "And I told you to rest. Remember that." Veyros raised one clawed hand in a gesture that could have been a salute. "The Silver Ridge owes you a debt. When the wind carries your call, we will answer." The warriors took to the sky. Once more, their shadows stretching across the plains as they vanished into the brightening day. Marin stood watching the horizon long after they were gone. The promise lingered in the wind, a reminder that the world had shifted in ways that could not be undone. Behind her, the settlement stirred to life, unaware of how close they had stood. To the edge. For now, there was no war. For now, there was time. And in that fragile space between fear and trust, Marin knew she would do whatever it took to keep the promise alive.